She laughed at my honesty, not once, not just in passing. Over time, it became a habit, like brushing her teeth or checking her phone every 10 minutes. She treated my openness as if it were a punchline, something cute, inconvenient, maybe even pathetic. And for the longest time, I let her. Grace and I had been together for a little over 2 years. When we met, it was that electric kind of connection you don't question. You just follow. She had that presence, sharp, magnetic, and always the center of attention in a room full of people. I was more subdued, content in my quiet truth. I believed in conversations that meant something, in saying how I felt even when it was uncomfortable. Especially then. The first time she laughed when I opened up to her, I brushed it off. We were having dinner, nothing fancy, just Thai takeout at my place. I told her I'd had a rough week at work and was feeling overwhelmed. She giggled, said, "God, Mark, you're so dramatic," and reached for the spring rolls. I smiled, though it didn't quite reach my eyes. Maybe she didn't mean anything by it. Maybe that was just her way of deflecting discomfort. I gave her the benefit of the doubt. But it happened again, and again. Every time I brought something real to the table, my worries about my aging father, my insecurities about a project I wasn't sure I could deliver on, the hollow loneliness I sometimes felt even with her next to me, she met it with the same chuckle, the same head tilt, and some version of "you're being too sensitive" or "you always think so much." What started as small bruises turned into invisible fractures. Her laughter wasn't just about my honesty. It was about who I was, and it chipped away at something sacred. I remember one night in particular. We were lying in bed, and I told her I was afraid. Not of her, not of being alone, but of becoming someone I didn't recognize. Someone who stayed quiet just to keep the peace. I said, "I'm afraid I'm losing myself." And she just looked at me with a smirk and said, "Mark, you worry too much. Can't you just enjoy the moment?" That moment didn't feel enjoyable. It felt like being erased. And something in me shifted. I realized that my honesty, the very thing I thought would bring us closer, had become a mirror she didn't want to look into, because it asked something of her, and she wasn't willing to give it. I stared at the ceiling that night for hours, listening to her breath slow into sleep beside me. I was still in my body, still in my silence, but inside, a storm was forming. At first I thought I could handle it, that her laughter was just a quirk, something harmless, maybe even a defense mechanism. I told myself we all have our ways of navigating emotional discomfort. I believed she just didn't know how to sit with vulnerability, that maybe she wasn't used to people being this honest with her. But somewhere along the line, it stopped feeling like a misunderstanding and started to feel like disrespect. What hurt wasn't just the laughter, it was what it meant. It meant that when I spoke, I wasn't heard, that my feelings weren't taken seriously, that my emotional truth, which I offered freely, was consistently rejected in favor of keeping things light, breezy, surface level, and I couldn't live in the shallow end forever. I wasn't built for that. I remember the first time I really questioned why I was staying. We had just gotten back from dinner with her friends. A couple of them were talking about emotional boundaries and how important it was to be authentic in relationships. I shared a story about something vulnerable, a falling out I had with my brother years ago, something that still lingered in my heart. I said it had changed the way I looked at forgiveness. Her friends nodded thoughtfully. Grace, on the other hand, rolled her eyes and said, "Mark always finds a way to make everything so deep." It landed like a slap. The people around the table went quiet. One of her friends gave me an awkward smile and quickly changed the subject. Grace didn't even notice. Or worse, she didn't care. That moment replayed in my mind for days afterward. It was one of many small cuts that I tried to ignore, but it festered. I began to withdraw in subtle ways. I stopped bringing up how I was feeling about things, choosing silence over another belittling chuckle. I told myself I was just giving her space, or not trying to be too heavy. But in truth, I was shrinking. I was folding in on myself to fit into a space where I was no longer seen. And she didn't notice that either. Or maybe she did and just found it easier that way. We would sit together in the same room, sharing the same couch, watching the same show, but miles apart in silence. She'd laugh at something on the screen, and I'd force a smile, pretending everything was fine. But deep inside, it wasn't. There was this growing void, this ache that couldn't be filled with sex or small talk or weekend getaways. The hardest part wasn't the loneliness. It was the fact that I wasn't alone. Being emotionally isolated while physically together is a special kind of pain. You start to question your own worth. You wonder if maybe you are too much, too serious, too open. You begin to edit yourself, trimming away the parts that feel inconvenient for the other person. And one day, you look in the mirror and realize you've become a version of yourself you barely recognize. Quiet, reserved, overly cautious with your own heart. And yet I stayed, because I loved her, because I believed in loyalty and the promise of what we could be. I clung to the moments in between, the rare flickers of affection, the nights where she curled up next to me without judgment, the inside jokes we still managed to share. I kept hoping that if I just loved her a little harder, she might soften. That maybe one day she'd see what I was offering and finally understand what it cost me to keep showing up this way. But love is not a transaction. You can't keep investing in someone who offers nothing in return, but apathy wrapped in charm. I didn't want a partner who worshiped me. I just wanted one who respected me, who understood that honesty isn't a flaw to be tolerated, but a gift to be cherished. There's a weight to not being taken seriously that most people don't talk about. It drains you slowly. You start off feeling misunderstood. Then you feel invisible. And eventually, you feel foolish. For trying, for hoping, for believing that your truth could mean something to someone who only ever laughed at it. By the time the emotional cost became clear, it was already too late to recover what we had. The damage was layered, ingrained in how we spoke to each other, or rather how we didn't. Her laughter had stopped being just dismissive. It became cruel. It became the sound I heard in my head every time I thought of opening up again. And that's when I knew. This wasn't love anymore. It was survival. And no one should have to survive their own relationship. It didn't happen all at once. The decision to leave her wasn't a lightning bolt or a single dramatic scene. It built itself slowly over time, like sediment forming at the bottom of a still lake. Each moment she laughed off my truth. Each time I swallowed a feeling, instead of speaking it, another layer was added to that silent resolve. And then, without warning, I reached the point where it wasn't a choice anymore. It was the only thing left. The final moment was quiet. There was no screaming, no glass-shattering argument, no cinematic confrontation. It was a Tuesday. Just another regular evening where everything looked fine from the outside. We were sitting at the dining table, a bottle of wine between us. Grace was scrolling through her phone, absent-mindedly laughing at something she'd read. I was trying to talk to her. Something small at first, about work stress. Something ordinary. But then I let it spill out. I told her how I'd been feeling lately, not in a desperate, pleading way, but calmly. Honestly, like I'd done dozens of times before. She didn't even look up from her phone. "Mark, you really need to stop making everything so emotional. Can't we just have dinner without a therapy session?" That sentence, so casually tossed into the air like a paper napkin, hit me harder than she could have imagined. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the final confirmation of what I'd been suspecting for months. She didn't see me. Not really. And worse, she didn't care to. I could have screamed. I could have demanded her attention, begged for her to understand me. But I didn't. I just nodded, took a sip of water, and went silent. She continued scrolling. I watched her then. Not the woman I fell in love with, but the one sitting across from me. Beautiful, sharp-tongued, always in control. Someone who had mastered the art of dismissing anything that made her uncomfortable. Someone who, despite all her charisma and intelligence, was emotionally bankrupt when it came to intimacy. I realized that the woman I thought I loved had been more of a hope than a reality. And in that moment, the breaking didn't feel like an explosion. It felt like an exhale. A long, weary breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for 2 years. Something inside me, something stubborn, loyal, and deeply tired, just let go. After dinner, We watched an episode of some show she liked. I don't remember what it was. I sat beside her nodding, pretending to care, while my mind was somewhere else entirely. I was picturing my suitcase. I was listing what I'd need. I was calculating what bank accounts were joint, which ones were still in my name. I was planning my exit not out of vengeance, but out of clarity. Not to hurt her, but to finally stop hurting myself. She laughed a few more times that night. Not at me, at the TV, at her phone, at a text from a friend. Each laugh echoed like an empty shell in my ears. I no longer found her laughter beautiful or lively. I found it hollow, like an echo inside a place I didn't belong anymore. Later that night, lying beside her in bed, I stayed awake. I watched the rise and fall of her breath. I looked at the ceiling, not thinking, just existing in the moment. A strange peace settled over me. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I just felt done. The next morning, I made coffee like I always did. I kissed her forehead like I always did. I told her to have a good day like I always did. But I knew this wasn't always anymore. This was the last morning we'd share. I spent the day clearing my mind and confirming the details. I rented a short-term place across town. I packed lightly but deliberately. The essentials. A few personal items. Nothing dramatic or obvious. Just enough to get by while I figured out the next chapter. I left late that night. She was asleep. There was no note, no explanation. Just my absence, clean and complete. She wouldn't understand right away, maybe not even for weeks, but eventually she would wake up and realize I was gone, and that I wasn't coming back. Walking away wasn't an act of cruelty, it was an act of preservation. I had given her every chance to meet me where I stood. I had shown her the map to my soul and invited her to explore it. Instead, she laughed at the language I spoke, dismissed the landscape of my emotions as unnecessary, inconvenient. She wanted a version of me that didn't exist, a man who never felt deeply, who never asked for emotional reciprocity. So I gave her what she seemed to want. I gave her silence, not out of pettiness, but because explanations had become pointless. What more could I say that I hadn't already said a dozen times? The truth had never been the issue. Her refusal to see it was, and sometimes the most powerful thing a man can say is nothing. When I walked out of Grace's apartment for the last time, I didn't slam the door. I didn't even close it quickly. I pulled it shut slowly, softly, as though the quiet pulled away. I didn't look up at the apartment window. I didn't need to. That life was behind me, and I had no desire to turn it into a theater scene with a metaphorical glance backward. That story had already ended the night she laughed at me for the last time. What struck me most in those first few hours of freedom wasn't sadness or regret. It was stillness. My phone was silent. No texts, no calls. She hadn't realized I was gone yet, and I knew it might take her until the next day. Or maybe even longer. We'd grown so distant, so accustomed to functioning like polite strangers under the same roof, that my absence wouldn't be immediately obvious. And somehow that fact carried its own kind of sorrow. The kind that doesn't sting. It just settles, deep and cold, in your bones. When morning came and I woke up in the small temporary apartment I'd rented, the sunlight spilled in through cheap blinds. It wasn't the kind of place I was used to, no matching furniture, no curated aesthetic, but for the first time in months, the silence in the room didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. There was no tension in the air. No walking on eggshells. No pretending I was okay when I wasn't. I drank my coffee slowly, savoring the quiet like it was a luxury I hadn't realized I'd been deprived of. Around 9 a.m., my phone finally lit up. First, a text. "Where are you?" Then another. "Mark, are you okay?" Then a string of calls. I didn't answer any of them. Not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to say. I had already said it all, over and over, with patience, with hope, with vulnerability. And every time she met me with sarcasm or apathy, or that little smirk that told me my words weren't landing, weren't being felt, she hadn't heard me then, and she didn't deserve the privilege of hearing me now. Silence, I realized, is not just an absence of words. It's a message in itself. a statement, a boundary. And it says so much more than a well-crafted goodbye ever could. When you've been emotionally dismissed enough times, you eventually learn that sometimes the most powerful closure you can offer is your absence. The text kept coming. Why didn't you say anything? We could have talked about this. You just left? And then came the shift. You're acting childish. Running away won't solve anything. The tone changed quickly, from confusion to concern to condescension. It was so familiar it almost made me laugh. This was exactly how she treated my honesty when I offered it to her face. Something to scoff at, to invalidate, to undermine. She still didn't understand that I wasn't running. I wasn't escaping. I was choosing myself for the first time in years. I turned my phone off. That day, I went for a walk. No destination. Just moving through the streets, watching people live their lives, listening to the city breathe. I had no desire to tell my story to anyone. Not yet. It was too raw, too sacred. But in the quiet rhythm of my steps, I felt something stirring, a sense of self returning, bit by bit. I was still here. I hadn't been lost. I had just been quieted. I passed a bookstore and ducked inside, bought a journal, sat in the park, and wrote until my hand cramped. Not a letter to her, not a breakup monologue. Just my thoughts, my real ones, the kind I used to share with her before I learned they weren't safe in her hands. That night I fell asleep without a weight on my chest, without wondering if I'd said too much, without dreading the next conversation. I was alone, yes, but I was finally whole. Grace would eventually come to understand what I had done and why. Maybe not today, maybe not even next month. But one morning, she would reach for me, figuratively or literally, and remember that I was no longer there. And in that silence, in that absence, she would finally hear the truth she had laughed at so many times before. And this time, no one would be laughing. The first few days after I left, Grace passed like a muted dream. There were no fireworks of liberation, no triumphant music playing in my head. Just the soft, constant hum of reality settling in. Freedom isn't loud. Sometimes it's just the ability to sit in your own silence without feeling like you're disappearing. Grace kept trying to reach me. Her texts became more frequent, less composed. I saw the progression, the confusion turning to worry, then to blame, and finally to desperation. I didn't respond to any of it. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I knew there was no conversation left to have. My silence was not revenge, it was self-preservation. She had laughed at my vulnerability so often that by the time I walked away, I had nothing left to explain. She tried calling late at night, the kind of hour when people start to realize the weight of what they've lost. At first, I'd glance at the screen and simply let the calls ring out. Eventually, I turned off notifications altogether. I didn't need to hear the sound of her voice to know what she was going to say. Apologies, promises, pleas for one more conversation. But I also knew those words would come from the same mouth that once dismissed mine, like they were a burden. Days turned into weeks. The world didn't pause. Work continued. Life went on. But inside me, something had shifted permanently. There was a lightness in my chest that I hadn't felt in years, a kind of quiet confidence that came from finally choosing myself. I no longer second-guessed my words, or edited my emotions, or wondered whether I was too much for the person I loved. I was just me, and it was enough. Friends began to notice the change. They said I seemed more present, more grounded. One even joked that I looked 5 years younger. I didn't mention Grace, didn't retell the story unless asked. When I did, I kept it simple. She didn't take me seriously, I would say. So I left. There was power in that sentence. Not drama, not heartbreak, just truth. Eventually, Grace stopped reaching out. The messages ceased, the calls ended. Her silence was a delayed echo of my own. I imagined her sitting with it, as I once had to sit with hers. The absence of communication doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it's just a hollow room where realization finally has space to speak. I never wished her harm. I didn't hate her. But I also didn't miss her. Not really. What I missed was the idea of what we could have been if she had met me where I stood instead of mocking the very ground I walked on. I grieved the potential more than the person. And when that grief passed, there was nothing left to mourn. One evening, months later, I saw her name appear on social media, a tagged photo at a friend's wedding. She was smiling. She looked beautiful, polished, composed. But as I studied her face, I didn't feel that old pull. There was no longing, no ache, just recognition. She was someone I used to know. Someone who had taught me the cost of being laughed at when you're telling the truth. Whoa, lesson I'd never forget. Sometimes, people don't break you with cruelty. They break you with indifference, with their refusal to treat your emotions as valid, with their habit of turning vulnerability into a joke. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. When someone makes a mockery of your honesty, you don't owe them a dramatic ending. You owe them nothing. Not even a goodbye.